Jackson sat at the far end of the long dining table, his eyes fixed on the flickering candle in front of him. The soft amber light danced across the polished surface, reflecting off the glasses filled with wine and the pristine porcelain plates adorned with Emily's best china. It was a dinner meant to celebrate Thomas's recent success, a dinner that Jackson had reluctantly agreed to attend despite knowing exactly how the night would unfold. The room was filled with the scent of rosemary and thyme from the roast Emily had spent hours preparing, and the sound of clinking glasses as his father, Robert, raised his wine in yet another toast to Thomas's achievements. "To my son-in-law," Robert said, his voice booming with pride. "A man who doesn't just talk about success, but actually achieves it." His gaze drifted briefly to Jackson, and the smile on his face tightened, almost as if the sight of his eldest son dampened his mood. Jackson shifted in his seat, feeling the familiar sting of his father's disapproval. Thomas basked in the attention, a smug grin plastered across his handsome face. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that Jackson knew cost more than his entire month's salary, Thomas oozed confidence as he recounted the story of how he'd secured a massive investment for his tech startup. "It wasn't easy," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair as if he were a king on a throne. "But when you're willing to take risks, put yourself out there, and connect with the right people, things just start falling into place." "Not everyone has that kind of drive," Robert said, his eyes lingering on Jackson for a beat too long. "Some people are content to just coast through life, barely scraping by." Jackson clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. He could feel his mother, Linda, watching him with that familiar look of pity and disappointment. The same look she had given him when he'd graduated from college without honors. The same look she gave him whenever Thomas recounted another of his so-called victories in business. "Jackson, are you still at that tech support job?" Robert asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "What's it been now? 3 years? 4? Jackson swallowed hard. "I'm a software developer, Dad," he said, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "I write code. I work on system integrations." "Oh, right," Thomas interjected, his tone as patronizing as it was condescending. "I guess some people are more comfortable behind a computer screen than out there making real connections." The room erupted in laughter, and Jackson's cheeks burned with shame. Emily's eyes met his from across the table, but she quickly looked away as if she couldn't bear to see the pain etched in her brother's expression. Jackson's gaze dropped to his plate, the roast sitting untouched as the conversation around him swirled with talk of investments, business ventures, and weekend getaways to the Hamptons. "And what about relationships, Jackson?" Robert pressed, his voice louder now as the wine loosened his tongue. "Any new girlfriends? Or are you still too busy with all that coding?" Linda shot her husband a warning look, but it was too late. The damage was done. The air in the room grew heavy, and Jackson's pulse quickened as his father's words hung in the air like a noose. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What was the point? Anything he said would only be twisted, mocked, dissected under the harsh scrutiny of his father's expectations and Thomas's smug, self-satisfied grin. "I heard Jackson's company didn't even offer bonuses this year," Thomas said, swirling the wine in his glass. "That's rough, man. I mean, everyone in my firm got at least 20 grand. It's just a different league, you know?" Jackson could feel the heat rising in his chest, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. It wasn't that he was jealous of Thomas's money or his flashy lifestyle. It was the fact that his entire family seemed to measure a person's worth in dollars and cents. It was the way they made him feel small, invisible, like a shadow cast against the glaring light of Thomas's success. And then came the final blow. "Well, maybe if you spent less time tinkering with computers and more time making real connections, you wouldn't be such a failure," Robert said, setting his glass down with a loud clink. The word hung in the air like a physical slap. Failure. Jackson felt his chest tighten, a knot forming in his throat as he blinked rapidly, willing himself not to show any emotion. Emily's eyes darted nervously between her father and brother, but she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Thomas smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he were the king of the castle, watching a court jester fumble in the dirt. Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat, pushing his chair back and standing abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. He didn't wait for a response as he strode toward the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard, the cool evening air biting against his flushed skin. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the string of fairy lights Emily had hung for ambience. Jackson shoved his hands into his pockets, pacing the length of the patio as the word failure echoed in his mind. Was that what they thought of him? Was that all he was to them? A disappointment, a letdown, a man who couldn't measure up to Thomas's larger-than-life persona. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the long nights he spent working overtime, the freelance coding projects he took on to save money. They didn't know that he'd been the anonymous donor keeping their precious charity afloat for the past 6 months, that every penny he saved went to cover the costs they were too blind to notice. They didn't know that he'd been honoring his late mother's legacy in silence, without expecting anything in return. They didn't know that the so-called failure sitting at their table was the very reason their charity hadn't gone under. Jackson took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs as he gazed up at the starless sky. The sound of laughter drifted through the glass doors behind him, Thomas's booming voice rising above the rest. Jackson clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he made a silent vow. They could call him a failure all they wanted. They could belittle his job, mock his lifestyle, dismiss his quiet, unassuming ways. But when the truth finally came out, when they discovered who had been funding their beloved charity all along, they'd realize just how wrong they were. And Jackson couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces. Days had passed since the disastrous family dinner, but Jackson could still hear his father's words echoing in his mind like a relentless, taunting refrain. Failure. The word had lodged itself deep in his chest, a weight he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. It was as though his father's condemnation had solidified every insecurity he'd ever harbored, casting them in cold, unforgiving concrete. But Jackson had little time to dwell on his father's cutting remarks. At work, the pressure was mounting. He had just been assigned a critical project, a data migration for a high-profile client that required precision, attention to detail, and long hours in front of a screen. His small, windowless office became both a refuge and a prison, the glow of the monitor the only light in the otherwise dim room. Jackson worked tirelessly, pushing through fatigue and frustration, his eyes bleary from staring at lines of code for hours on end. The project was complex, filled with unexpected bugs and compatibility issues that demanded creative solutions. But in a way, the work was a distraction, a way to keep his mind off his family, off Thomas's smug grin, off the label of failure that still clung to him like a second skin. But even amidst the chaos of work, the charity remained on his mind. It was the one thing that brought him solace, the one act of quiet defiance that no one knew about. Every month, Jackson siphoned a portion of his salary into a separate account, funds he then anonymously donated to the family charity. It wasn't a substantial sum by Thomas's standards, but it was enough to keep the charity afloat, to cover the costs of food, shelter, and educational programs for the children it served. Jackson had grown up watching his mother pour her heart and soul into that charity. He remembered the way her eyes lit up whenever she spoke about the children, the joy she felt knowing she was making a difference in their lives. Even when money was tight, she never hesitated to give what little she had, insisting that those children needed it more. When she died, Jackson vowed to continue her legacy, to honor her memory by quietly supporting the charity, even if it meant sacrificing his own comforts. But the charity was struggling now. Donations had dwindled, operating costs had increased, and Emily was desperate to find a way to keep it going. Jackson knew she cared about the charity. It was the last tangible connection she had to their mother. But she was also under immense pressure from Thomas, whose insatiable hunger for status and success left little room for altruism. Thomas saw the charity as a drain on their resources, a relic of a less prosperous time that no longer fit their upscale lifestyle. And so, when Emily called a family meeting to discuss the charity's financial crisis, Jackson knew it would be yet another opportunity for Thomas to assert his dominance. The meeting was held in Emily and Thomas's sprawling home, a modern mansion with glass walls and sleek, minimalist decor that screamed wealth and success. Jackson arrived late, having been held up at work, and slipped quietly into the back of the living room where the rest of the family was already gathered. His father sat next to Thomas, nodding along as Thomas spoke in his usual self-assured, grandiose manner. Emily stood near the fireplace, her hands wringing nervously as she listened to her husband's latest plan. So, as I was saying, Thomas continued, pacing back and forth like a general addressing his troops, I've already reached out to several of my investor friends. I've told them all about the charity and how much it means to our family. I'm confident that with the right pitch, we can secure some serious donations. That's wonderful, Thomas, Robert said, his eyes shining with admiration. I knew we could count on you. Jackson remained silent, his jaw clenched as he watched Thomas bask in the praise that wasn't his to claim. The truth was, Thomas had done nothing. The recent influx of funds that had prevented the charity from closing its doors hadn't come from Thomas or his investor friends. It had come from Jackson, but he said nothing. Emily cleared her throat, her voice shaky as she addressed the room. Actually, we've already received a substantial donation. It came in last week, enough to cover all operating costs for the next 2 years. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Robert leaned forward, his brow furrowed. 2 years? That's incredible. Who donated that much? Emily shook her head, her expression a mixture of relief and confusion. That's the thing. The donor wanted to remain anonymous. All they sent was a brief note saying it was in honor of Mom's legacy. Jackson's heart raced as he listened to Emily speak, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had sent that note, typed out the words with trembling hands before hitting send. He hadn't wanted credit. He hadn't wanted recognition. He just wanted to do the right thing, to keep his mother's dream alive without making a spectacle of himself. But now, Thomas was stepping forward, his chest puffed out like a peacock as he grinned smugly at the room. Well, I did mention the charity to several of my investors, he said, his voice dripping with false modesty. Maybe one of them decided to step up. I didn't want to take credit, but... Robert slapped Thomas on the back, his laughter booming through the room. That's my son-in-law, always thinking of others. I knew it had to be you, Thomas. Jackson's stomach churned as Thomas accepted the praise with a gracious nod, as though he truly believed he was the one responsible. Emily's eyes met Jackson's for a brief moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them before she looked away. So what's the next step? Robert asked, turning to Thomas. How do we keep the momentum going? Thomas's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of holding the room's attention. We need to throw a gala. Something big, something flashy. We invite all the investors, all the donors, and we make sure they know how much we appreciate their generosity. It's the perfect opportunity to solidify our connections and keep the money flowing. Emily nodded, her expression tense. I think that's a great idea. Jackson remained seated, his hands clenched into fists under the table. A gala, a celebration of generosity that Thomas would undoubtedly take credit for. A room full of people congratulating him for being a hero, while Jackson stood in the background, invisible, unacknowledged, a failure whose only crime was choosing to remain anonymous. But he couldn't say anything, not without revealing the truth and exposing himself to further ridicule. Not without proving his father right, that he was just a failure seeking attention, desperate to be noticed, incapable of doing a good deed without demanding a pat on the back. The room buzzed with excitement as the family began discussing plans for the gala, each suggestion grander and more extravagant than the last. Thomas's voice boomed above the rest, throwing out ideas for champagne fountains and celebrity speakers, while Robert beamed at his son-in-law as though he were the second coming of Christ. Jackson sat quietly, his jaw clenched, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to remain composed. The room spun around him, the noise growing louder, the laughter more grating, the praise more nauseating. And as he sat there, his gaze fixed on the floor, Jackson made a silent vow. He would attend the gala, He would stand in the shadows and watch as Thomas took credit for his donation, as the family sang Thomas's praises and hailed him as a savior. And then, when the time was right, Jackson would reveal the truth. Not for revenge, not for validation, but for the one person who had always believed in him, his mother. Because she had never seen him as a failure. And that was the only opinion that had ever mattered. The day of the gala arrived under a sky heavy with rain clouds, the dark gray threatening to unleash a downpour at any moment. Jackson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He stared at his own reflection, the dark circles under his eyes a stark contrast against his pale skin. He had barely slept in the days leading up to the event, his mind consumed by a storm of conflicting emotions. Anxiety gnawed at his insides, a relentless, churning ache that refused to settle. The truth was, Jackson wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to face his father, to look Thomas in the eye, to stand in a room filled with people who would undoubtedly praise his brother-in-law for a donation he hadn't made. He wasn't ready to reveal himself as the true benefactor, to step out of the shadows and demand recognition for what he'd done. But the decision had already been made. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, Jackson tightened the knot on his tie, adjusted his collar, and slipped into the tailored suit he had saved for special occasions. It was a simple, dark gray suit, the only one he owned, purchased years ago for a wedding he barely remembered. It wasn't as expensive or flashy as Thomas's designer wardrobe, but it would do. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had started to fall, fat droplets pattering against the windshield of his aging sedan. The drive to the gala felt longer than it should have, the city streets blurred and gray under the relentless rain. Jackson gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. His mind replayed every conversation from the last family dinner, every cruel word his father had uttered, every smug grin that had spread across Thomas's face. When Jackson finally pulled up to the venue, he was greeted by the sight of a line of luxury cars parked in front of the Grand Hotel. Mercedes, BMWs, Bentleys, all gleaming under the soft, golden lights of the entrance. His sedan looked out of place among them, a dull, battered vehicle amidst a sea of polished steel. Jackson swallowed the lump in his throat, straightened his shoulders, and forced himself to step out of the car. Inside, the lobby was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting shimmering light across the room. Guests milled about in designer gowns and tailored suits, champagne flutes clinking as they exchanged hollow pleasantries. Jackson felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. He was surrounded by people who lived in a different world, a world where money and status were the only currencies that mattered. And at the center of it all stood Thomas. Thomas was dressed in a custom-made suit, his hair slicked back, his smile dazzling and bright. He moved through the crowd like a politician working the room, shaking hands, clapping backs, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Emily hovered at his side, her smile strained, her eyes darting nervously through the crowd as if searching for someone. Jackson kept to the edges of the room, blending into the shadows, his eyes never leaving Thomas. He watched as his brother-in-law regaled a group of donors with yet another exaggerated tale of his business acumen, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. It wasn't easy, Thomas said, pausing to take a sip of champagne. But when you know the right people, when you're willing to take risks, success just falls into place. Jackson's jaw clenched. He knew what was coming next. And of course, Thomas continued, raising his glass with a self-satisfied grin. I couldn't let my wife's family's charity go under. I reached out to my investor friends, made a few calls, and well, here we are. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jackson felt the blood rush to his face. It was as though every word Thomas spoke was a knife twisting deeper into his chest. Thomas was taking credit for a donation he hadn't made, a donation that had come from Jackson's own savings, from the money he had sacrificed to honor his late mother's legacy. Jackson's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to scream. He wanted to walk up to Thomas, grab him by the collar, and force him to admit the truth. But instead, he stayed where he was, rooted to the spot, his nails digging into his palms as he watched Thomas bask in the glory that wasn't his to claim. Meanwhile, Emily stood off to the side, her eyes darting between Thomas and the crowd, her expression conflicted. Jackson knew she was struggling, caught between loyalty to her husband and the gnawing sense that something wasn't right. But Emily was too afraid to speak up, too conditioned to keep the peace, too accustomed to letting Thomas dictate the narrative. As the night wore on, the tension in Jackson's chest grew tighter, the room feeling smaller, the air thinner. He couldn't stay there, couldn't watch Thomas continue to lie, continue to steal the credit for Jackson's sacrifice. He slipped away from the crowd, weaving through the throng of guests until he reached the terrace doors. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the air cool and damp. Jackson stepped out onto the terrace, the cold air biting through his thin suit. He gripped the stone railing, his knuckles white as he leaned forward, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He couldn't do it. He couldn't go back in there and pretend that everything was fine. He couldn't smile and nod while Thomas accepted praise for a donation he hadn't made. He couldn't stand by and let his father continue to look at him as though he were a failure, a disappointment, a man who had never accomplished anything of value. Jackson's eyes burned with unshed tears, the ache in his chest a dull, persistent throb. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with memories of his mother, her soft voice, her gentle hands, the way she'd smiled at him whenever he brought home a report card filled with A's. "You're so smart, Jackson," she used to say, her voice filled with love and pride. "You're going to do great things." But she was gone now, and all that remained was the memory of her words, the ache of her absence, and the emptiness left behind by a family that saw him as nothing more than a failure. "Jackson?" The voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around herself as though to ward off the chill. "What are you doing out here?" Jackson swallowed, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Just needed some air." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking back toward the ballroom where the crowd was still applauding Thomas. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice trembling. Did you make the donation?" Jackson's heart stopped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Emily stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Thomas keeps saying it was his investor friends, but something doesn't feel right. And that note, the one that said it was in honor of Mom's legacy, it sounded like you." Jackson swallowed, his throat tight. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading, the moment he'd been waiting for. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, and met Emily's gaze. "Yes," he said, his voice low but steady. "It was me." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her hand flying to her mouth as she stifled a sob. "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you say anything?" Jackson looked away, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding. "Because it wasn't about me. It was about Mom. It was always about Mom." Inside, the applause continued, the sound of Thomas's voice rising above the crowd, louder and more confident than ever. And as Jackson stood there, staring out into the night, he knew that the moment of truth was coming. The time to stay silent was over. And when he finally walked back into that ballroom, he would make sure everyone knew the real story. Jackson stepped back into the ballroom, his heart pounding with each deliberate step. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne, the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations buzzing like static in his ears. The overhead chandeliers cast fractured light across the room, making everything shimmer in an almost surreal way. But all Jackson could focus on was the stage, the elevated platform where Thomas stood, basking in the glow of the spotlight. Thomas's voice carried over the crowd, smooth and confident, as he continued his speech. He spoke with exaggerated humility, his eyes sweeping across the room with practiced charm. "When Emily and I heard about the charity's financial difficulties," he said, placing a hand over his chest in a gesture of false sincerity, "we knew we couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I reached out to my network of investors, people who understand the importance of giving back. And thanks to their generosity, We were able to secure the funds needed to keep our mother's legacy alive." The room erupted in applause, and Jackson's jaw clenched so hard that his teeth ached. Thomas's lie echoed through the room like a thunderclap, each word a blatant theft of the truth. Emily stood off to the side, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her expression strained as she watched her husband soak in the praise meant for her brother. Jackson's gaze shifted to his father, Robert, who sat in the front row, his eyes shining with pride as he clapped loudly for his golden son-in-law. Beside him, Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her lips curved in a watery smile. It was as if the entire room had fallen under Thomas's spell, as if his false narrative had completely erased the truth. But not for long. Jackson straightened his spine, his shoulders squaring as he stepped forward, weaving his way through the crowd. He could feel his pulse thundering in his ears, his palms damp with sweat, but his resolve was unshakable. The truth had been buried for too long, and tonight it was finally coming to light. As he approached the stage, Thomas was wrapping up his speech. "And so, on behalf of the entire family," Thomas said, spreading his arms wide as if he were some kind of benevolent king, "I want to thank everyone here tonight for their support. You've all made this possible, and we couldn't have done it without you." Jackson reached the foot of the stage just as Thomas stepped back, flashing a dazzling smile as the audience erupted into another round of applause. Jackson's fists clenched at his sides, the muscles in his jaw working as he forced himself to breathe deeply to steady himself. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him, whispers rippling through the crowd as people recognized him as the failure son, the black sheep, the quiet, unremarkable brother. Thomas's smile faltered when he saw Jackson standing there, his expression tightening into something cold and wary. "Jackson," he said, his tone clipped, "what are you doing up here?" Jackson stepped onto the stage, his gaze never leaving Thomas's. The tension between them was palpable, a live wire stretched taut and ready to snap. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting nervously between her brother and her husband, as though she could feel the impending storm. Jackson took the microphone from the stand, his fingers trembling as he held it close. He turned to face the crowd, the sea of faces staring back at him with expressions ranging from confusion to curiosity to outright disdain. But Jackson's focus remained on his father, whose brow furrowed as he leaned forward, clearly perplexed. "Good evening, everyone," Jackson began, his voice steady but laced with raw emotion. "I know most of you don't know me. Or if you do, you probably only know me as Thomas's brother-in-law or as Robert and Linda's disappointing son." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jackson pressed on. "I'm not here to talk about my job or my lack of flashy accomplishments. I'm here to talk about the truth, about what really happened with the charity." Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he took a step closer. "Jackson, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Jackson cut in, his gaze never leaving his brother-in-law's. "You see, for the past 6 months, the charity has been struggling to stay afloat. My sister Emily has been working tirelessly to keep it going, and yet, every month, the bills kept piling up. Until last month, when a large anonymous donation came in. A donation that was enough to cover all operating expenses for the next 2 years. The crowd murmured louder now, heads swiveling to look at Thomas, who forced a tight, uncomfortable smile. "And as you all heard tonight," Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger, "Thomas would have you believe that the donation came from his investors, that he was the one who made it happen. But that's not true." The room fell silent, the air heavy and tense. Thomas's face had gone white, his eyes narrowed dangerously. "Jackson," he said, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "Don't do this." But Jackson was done being silent. He was done being the quiet, invisible brother who let everyone walk all over him. He lifted his chin, his eyes blazing as he looked out over the crowd. "The donation didn't come from Thomas," he said, his voice ringing through the room like a gunshot. "It came from me." Gasps echoed through the ballroom, and Emily's hand flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes as she stared at her brother. Linda's face crumpled in confusion, her brows knitting together as she turned to Robert, who looked as though he'd been struck. Thomas's expression was murderous, his fists clenched at his sides as he stepped closer to Jackson. "You're lying," he said through gritted teeth. "You don't have that kind of money." "No," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "I don't, but I saved for months. I took on freelance work. I cut back on expenses. I sacrificed so much just to make that donation because I wanted to honor Mom's memory, because she believed in that charity, because she believed in helping those kids. And you," Jackson said, his eyes boring into Thomas's, "you took credit for it. You stood up here and let everyone think you were the hero, that you were the generous benefactor. But it was never you." The room was deathly silent. Thomas's face was ashen, his jaw working as he struggled to come up with a response. But there was nothing he could say. The truth was out. The lie had been exposed. Jackson turned to his father then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You call me a failure," he said, his voice breaking. "You said I had nothing to show for my life. But I did this. I kept Mom's legacy alive. Not for recognition, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do." Robert's face crumpled, his eyes filling with tears as he rose from his seat, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his own words had finally crushed him. Jackson lowered the microphone, his chest heaving as he stepped away from the stage. The room was still silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Emily rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around her brother, holding him tightly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know." Jackson held her close, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to breathe for the first time in what felt like years. The truth was out. The lie was shattered. And for the first time, Jackson felt free. Free from the shadow of his brother-in-law. Free from his father's expectations. Free to be himself, flaws and all. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the rain had stopped and the clouds had parted, revealing a sky full of stars. Jackson took a deep breath, his chest light and unburdened, and walked away from the hotel, his head held high. He was no longer a failure. He was finally free.